As with me, I have the senior police surgeon for Northamptonshire. That's Dr. Delahaye Davis. Dr. Davis, Hugh, Shemai, thank you for coming in. Shemai, of course, because you're, like me, a Welshman.
That's right, yes.
It's going to be a Welsh half hour, I'm afraid, everyone. We're going to be reminiscing about Wales. First of all, it's a fascinating title, senior police surgeon. Now, I'm sure everybody thinks straight away of the streets of San Francisco and that big ambulance driving around with a young police surgeon inside, solving all the crimes. I assume it's nothing like that at all.
No, we don't in this country have full-time police surgeons like they have in America, and I should stress that the doctor is not a policeman in any way. He is usually a family doctor, a general practitioner, who's retained by the police to give all forms of medical aid, and this literally covers a multitude of sins. And he has also the job of advising his senior police officers on the health of the men, and he, in a way, is an occupational physician as well. Right. But above all, he is a general medical practitioner.
It's a very wide area of work, then, isn't it? And I know you yourself are no longer a GP. You're involved now in specialised medicine. But for your colleagues within the county who are also GPs and police surgeons, that must put an added strain upon them.
Well, it does, and doctors who do this work have to organise their practices so that they can be called out at a moment's notice. As a result of this, they usually have smaller national health lists. The other thing is that 50% of the work occurs between the hours of midnight and 8 a.m. So there should be opportunity for the doctor, if he wants to catch up on his sleep the next day.
And of course your work covers an area with the police from murder to drunk driving.
Oh yes, yes. All the anything to do with prisoners, with crime. And this is, of course, one of the problems today, is crime has become much more sophisticated in the last 25 years. So police surgeons have got to be very much more professional.
Before we go on to talk about specifically your job and what you have to do and all the rest of it, because we are going to talk about that in general terms in a moment, let's have a chat about you. Let's have a chat about you as the person. I mean, you're a Welshman. Whereabouts were you born in Wales?
In Cardiff.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, lovely old Cardiff, which I worked there for many years.
Wonderful city.
Yes, beautiful city. I'm sure I'm being employed by the Cardiff Tourist Board, actually, to plug it for them. How did you get involved in police surgery in Northamptonshire, then?
Well, I came here to do a locum for 6 weeks, in the Barratt, actually, in the Barratt maternity home.
Oh, yeah.
And I was going back probably to Wales after that, and lo and behold, I met my wife, and I've been here ever since. And when I completed my hospital jobs in Northampton General Hospital, I was fortunate enough to go into a practice where my late senior partner was the county police surgeon, and I became his deputy, and that was in Captain Bolton's day as chief constable. I've served with four chief constables I've served with now.
What year would that be then? That goes back about
1958.
58?
Yes.
Yes, that's right, because that was about 4 chief constables ago, wasn't it?
That was, yes.
And how about being senior police surgeon? That was just a natural development?
Well, there wasn't really a properly organised police surgeon service in the county. My late senior partner was the medical officer who examined the recruits and did what work was available in Northampton and around Northampton town, as it then was. But in the other parts of the county, they would try and get any doctor they could, particularly out in the rural areas, Thrapston and Silverstone, places like that. And this was a bit of a mess sometimes. Mind you, there wasn't the crime around that we've got today.
No, that's another point, isn't it? I suppose back in 58, let's try and think about it now. Northampton would have been the biggest town in the county.
That's right.
Corby was just beginning to grow, really,
correct.
wasn't it?
Yes.
Kettering and Wellingborough were the quiet little market towns.
Yes.
So there wouldn't have been that much demand, would there?
There wasn't much demand, really. And so any doctor would be called in, and then in 1967, the Road Safety Act came in, which was the first breathalyzer laws, as you call them, and a Home Office direction came out that all police forces had to have retained police surgeons, basically to deal with the drunken driver problem. And so Mr. Gott, who was then the chief constable, called me in and said, organise something, and I organised a network over the county, and I became the senior police surgeon. But I've got police surgeons now in Corby, Kettering, Wellingborough, Daventry, Towcester, who do not only drunken driving work, but in fact that's got very much less recently. They do all aspects of police surgeon work.
Yeah. In the old days, before 67, before the breath test came in, how did you manage to detect drunken drivers in those days? What was
it was a sporting game, really. You examined the person, and you had to say whether he was impaired or not. And this was always an examination that took half an hour. We didn't make them actually walk the white line. In some cases, there was no need to. They'd fall over as soon as you came into the room. But these cases would always go to the quarter sessions, and you'd have quite a battle there with counsel. And it was a way in which those of us older police surgeons learnt our court techniques, because we had some very hard sporting battles in Northamptonshire quarter sessions in those days.
That's an interesting point that you brought up there, the court technique. Is there such a thing? I mean, there is.
Oh, definitely, because not only, you see, has a police surgeon got to observe, make notes, and present his findings, but he's got to present them in such a way that they are intelligent to the jury and can withstand cross-examination, because the lawyers are very good at finding alternative explanations. And while one can concede a certain amount to lawyers, one has got to stick to the truth and put the case quite fairly and quite clearly. You've got to be very impartial. And the trouble today is, you see, young doctors and young policemen too, for that matter, they go into court, and probably their first case that they go into is a major case. A Crown Court Tier 1 job, and
yes.
And of course they haven't had the experience of the lower courts like we used to have.
So they find themselves in difficulty.
In great difficulty sometimes.
But of course in 1967 the breath test came in. Did that make life easier for you?
Well, at first it made it harder because we got many more night calls, and in fact I used to do the breath tests, the blood sampling myself in those days. I don't do so many now, but so it did mean a lot of night work. But the police now, having got an organised police surgeon service nationally, not just locally, but the service became very much more professional, and we were having us there. We were used, and we were used in all sorts of cases. Crimes of violence, sexual assaults. And indeed, this is the other thing, is that since the 60s there has been a great escalation in crimes of violence. And this is now the main part of my work, as opposed to drunken drivers. It is dealing with crimes of violence.
Appropriate we should mention that on a day in which there's a trial taking place concerning a crime of violence.
Yes, that indeed was one of my cases that I went out to.
But obviously we're not able to talk about that case.
Oh, no,
and we will not talk about it. But we're going to go on in a few minutes to talk in general terms about how a police surgeon works when he gets to the scene of a violent crime like a murder. We'll talk about just what the police surgeon has to do, what he has to discover, what he has to prove to himself. We'll come back to that in a minute. But we've got something coming up that I know you'll like, because, like me, actually, you're a bit of a military band lover. So, how about the Prince of Wales March? Do you fancy that?
Excellent choice.
Unfortunately, it's not by the band of the Welsh Guards. Couldn't find them, I'm afraid. But it's by the band of the Royal Military School of Music. a lovely piece, that is, isn't it? It's the Prince of Wales March, performed by the band of the Royal Military School of Music at Kneller Hall. My guest this afternoon, well, it's Dr. Delahaye Davis, who's the senior police surgeon for the county. Hugh, we were talking just before the music about the increase in violent crime within the county.
Yes.
Now, obviously, as senior police surgeon, you're unfortunately called to the scene of murders.
Yes.
You were saying yourself that the current one is one that you have been involved in. We can't talk about that, but can we talk in very general terms about a murder? If I set you a situation, can we talk around it a little bit?
Yes, indeed.
Let's assume that you're called out at 3 o'clock in the morning by the police to a flat in Northampton where a body has been found of a young lady and she's been stabbed. What would be the first thing that you did when you got there?
Well, the first thing that I would do is I would speak to the police officer who's outside the door. Immediately an officer is stationed to keep a running log, and I would ask the correct approach. Now, if you're going into a house where there is a body, you don't go through the door that the alleged assailant might have used. The police tape out a path for you to go in, and you go into the area without touching anything and keeping strictly to this path. Mm-hmm. And the policeman keeps a log of who goes down that path. And when one gets to the scene of the crime, if it's a murder, as you say, the first thing to do is, of course, to make sure the person is dead. Mm. Now, that's a doctor's duty, and if the person is not dead, well, then life-saving procedures take precedence. But
right.
If the person is dead, then you have to confirm death with the minimum of disturbance of the scene.
Stopping you a second, has it ever happened in your experience that you have been called to look at what you assumed was going to be a dead body and found that the person was in fact still alive?
It's never happened to me personally, thank goodness. But it has happened, particularly with overdoses of certain drugs, combined with cold temperature. The body can go into a state of suspended animation, which can easily be mistaken for death. This has happened.
Good Lord.
But
so, sorry, I interrupted you. You were just about to examine the body.
Yes, and when one examines the body and pronounces death, at that stage, one doesn't do very much more, because one waits now for the scene of crime team, which consists of the photographer, fingerprint expert, and, of course, the Home Office pathologist to arrive. Now, it may be that we're very fortunate here with Dr. Peter Andrews from Kettering, who can get to a scene fairly quickly, but if he's out of the county, then it may be several hours before he comes to the scene, and it may be necessary then for me to do a bit more at the scene, taking air temperatures, body temperatures, and helping to retrieve trace evidence with the scene of crime officers, which might otherwise go off. And I
don't mean to delve into the gory details, but what exactly do you mean by trace elements?
Well, trace evidence. If two bodies come into contact, there is usually an interchange of material between the bodies, like a girl's lipstick might be on a man's face, mm-hmm. hair from the man might be on the girl's clothing, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. Fibres from the carpet in the room may be on the girl's body and on the assailant's body. Mm-hmm. So, and there's all sorts of material which is passed, and this is where the job is so sophisticated these days, the skill in collecting this material to go to the forensic science laboratory. The skills have to be taught to police surgeons, because if the work of the laboratory is only as good as the samples it gets.
Yes.
And the police surgeon's main job at the scene of crime, with the scene of crime officer and the photographer, is picking up this trace evidence. Then, of course, assisting the pathologist. If the pathologist doesn't come, one has to do a full examination of the body, external examination first, and then the body is removed to the mortuary with a special technique of removing it, again, so that trace evidence is not lost. Mm-hmm. And air temperatures are taken, body temperatures are taken to help in trying to establish the time of death. And then the pathologist takes over. And most of the police surgeons in this county, we usually stay and assist the pathologist at the post-mortem.
Yes. What about the time of death? This is something that's always fascinated me. That how easy is it to tell the time of death? Because there are so many conditions coming to bear upon it, aren't there?
Well, there are. There's so many variables, and my old tutor in forensic medicine used to say to me, the only way to be certain of the time of death is to be there when it happens. And I think this is true. I think the best you can do is get a bracket, say from 10 o'clock last night, in between 10 o'clock last night and 2 o'clock this morning. There are various ways of doing this, but you can't be more specific than that. In fact, it's the collateral evidence, like the milk left on the step and the morning paper delivered, which gives you most of the clues, and it's very nice if you do a scientific estimation and then you find collateral evidence, physical evidence to back it up.
Yeah. What about the case where the body has been I'm sorry to be gory, everybody listening at this point, but I am actually fascinated by this whole area of getting information about a death, especially if it's information about a death in cases where the bodies have been around for a long, long time and have in fact decomposed to some degree. That obviously makes it a lot more difficult, doesn't it?
Extremely, yes. It is much more difficult, but it's like anything else. You've got to stick to your routine and you mustn't take shortcuts. You're taught in your forensic, and the police surgeons today are taught by the laboratories, the forensic laboratories, what they should do, and they must just stick to that routine and not take shortcuts. How
about you as an individual? When you were first called to a serious crime, to a murder like that, what was your feeling as a human being?
Well, at the time, one is very professional and one is purely concerned with getting the job right, and because you're working with, as a part of a team, with experienced policemen and photographers and people like this, and you're just a part of that team, and your whole thinking, it's tunnel vision if you like, but you're just thinking on what you should do next and what you shouldn't do, touching the wrong things, leaving your fingerprints in the wrong place and that type of thing.
But as a trained doctor, your one ambition in life must be to save life. That's the one thing as a doctor that you want to do. But when you go to the scene of a serious crime like that, you're looking at the results of one person who has intentionally killed another person, possibly. I mean, it must affect you.
Oh, it does, yes.
It must make you feel very depressed, I should
Well, think. Yes, of course. These things do leave mental scars on you. But one gets over it. One has, other things to think about.
And yet the other side of it, finding there's little bits of evidence on the body, what have you, bits of carpet, bits of hair, that must be a fascinating part of the job.
Well, this is the fascination of it, and not only with dead bodies, but with living people as well. And fortunately, 90% of my work is with living people. Yes. Being able to give that little bit of medical evidence which either establishes guilt in a person or equally lets somebody off who's not guilty. I think this is very important. The police surgeon, at times may be the public's only sort of protection against a high coefficient of police suspicion. And I've been, one of the most distressing things that I have to go to sometimes are these cot deaths.
Yes.
And sometimes, no matter how nicely the investigation is handled by police officers, and we have some very expert officers doing this, the parents always feel that suspicion is being levelled at them, and it's rewarding in a way that one can turn round to the police and say this is absolutely natural. And being able to do this, it does give one a sense of satisfaction.
That is the positive side of your job, isn't it, I suppose? Yes. That's where you, to some degree, you make a stand against the police who you work for, and you say, no, I'm sorry, the medical evidence doesn't support your suspicions.
Well, fortunately, the police are extremely grateful for such advice, because they don't want to be spending time and money on useless investigations.
No, right. Yes.
And if you can, and this is where police surgeons save the police a lot of money, because they can turn around right at the beginning of an investigation and say, sorry, chaps, this doesn't fit. And the medical evidence doesn't fit, and the police then have to look to another line of inquiry.
Hugh, I want to move away in a couple of minutes from the gory side of your job, the actual sort of investigation on the scene, and perhaps we can talk to some extent about increases in drinking, in drug abuse, in glue sniffing, for example, which is something I know that you are concerned about, and also to talk to some degree, about the life of being a doctor. Not just a police doctor, but a doctor, and the pressures that puts upon you and upon doctors themselves. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. Take a little... You said, actually, while the record was playing, probably a better title than police surgeon might be medical referee. Is that appropriate?
Oh, I think so, yes. Because you've got to be completely impartial in this job. First of all, you've got to be competent, of course, but impartiality is the name of the game. And the police don't like it if you're leaning too far towards them. In other words, you're a copper's doctor. And certainly the prisoners don't like it. And, of course, it would be quite wrong if you leant over backwards to help the police, because a man might get wrongly convicted on your evidence.
And so it has to be impartial? Strictly
impartial.
Yeah. Let's move on to talk about you as a general practitioner. You're not at the moment. I know you're involved in other sorts of medicine. But you spent a long time as a GP.
Yes, I did, yes. 24 years.
A rude question I'm going to put to you now. When you were an ordinary police surgeon in the early days dealing with drunken drivers, were a lot of them doctors?
I have, yes. I had, not a lot of them, but I have had a couple of doctors, yes.
Would you say proportionally, compared to other professions, the number of doctors who went through your hands was larger than proportionally in any other profession?
No, I don't think so. And that includes journalists, radio journalists as
well. What I'm throwing at you is yes, radio journalists and doctors are the people who have the highest propensity of alcohol problems, aren't they?
They do, and lawyers, I'm pleased to say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Obviously, it's to do with pressure of the job.
Oh, it is. It is a stressful job.
What is it, do you think, about a doctor's job that causes him to be under this sort of pressure? Because one thinks of the sort of Dr. Finley's casebook type thing, don't you? You know, the gentle-mannered, mild doctor sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, talking to the patients and explaining the problems. What is the stress?
Well, I think the job is so much more technical these days than in the Dr. Finley days. And there's a lot of pressure. The public are very much more demanding. They've been educated to ask what they're on about. And so a doctor is liable to be criticised much more. And I think doctors generally like to give orders and not to take orders. It's all a part of the mystique of medicine. And all this is changing. There's been rapid change in the last 30 years. I think, too, that people go more to doctors with their problems, whereas in the old days the schoolmasters, priests and other people would help out with problems and counselling. More and more of these problems are finding their ways to the doctors. And
you've become a bit of a confessor, then?
You do, and I think you tend to take some of your patients' problems to heart and, in fact, take them home with you if you're not careful.
Yeah. And that's when the trouble begins.
And I think this is where the trouble begins. Then there's the other business of being on call at the end of a telephone. When I was in general practice, I could answer the telephone bell on the first ring or even the click in the middle of the night. You get sort of keyed up in that way. And in fact, when I came out of general practice, and it took me about a year to get out of that sort of sleep.
So, yes, I mean, the majority of GPs, then, who are on call, just are not getting their proper rest, I suppose.
Well, they're not. I think the matter is improved now than when I first started in practice. I was on call every other night. But now there are, and quite rightly so, deputising services, and group practices form rotas, and I think this is so because you wouldn't allow an airline pilot or somebody to pilot an airplane, and yet you allow somebody to put their lives in the hands of a tired doctor. The whole thing has changed over the last 25 years.
This, I suppose, goes to doctors in hospitals as well, doesn't it? Especially the housemen in hospital who work extremely long hours.
They do. They work extremely long hours, and fortunately, again, there have been improvements in this respect, and hospital is now a safer place. But when I was a house surgeon, we again worked, usually we were on call nearly every night.
It seems very unfair that we put that sort of pressure on one group of society and expect accurate and precise judgments from them. You mentioned earlier the change that was happening in the medical profession. In the police, we see the police now, especially in Northamptonshire, going to what's called community policing. I mean, when
Yes.
I was young, it was called the Bobby on the beat, but that's another story. Is it true to say, perhaps, that in the medical profession, because of this pressure they're under, we're moving very swiftly away from the days of the old family doctor sitting on the side of the bed, chatting away to mum and her problems?
I think you are, yes. You are moving away, and I think this is, in those days, a doctor could offer very little except reassurance and advice. Nowadays, you've got a lot of high-powered technology and drugs that you can take to the patient's bedside, literally, and you've got to be. There is obviously a place for kindness and reassurance, but the job is much more technical today.
Let's move on to other sides of life that I know are concerning you greatly. Things like drug addiction and most especially glue sniffing, which I suppose drug addiction especially being something you come into contact with your job as police surgeon.
Yes, again, this sort of started in the 60s, the late 60s, when we were, I think society changed in general. National service finished and the permissive era began. Of course, in Northampton, we had the drug explosions in the 60s, and today, I don't think the problem is so great as it was then. We've still got a little hardcore of drug abusers, but nothing like it was in the late 60s. And regretfully, I've seen many young people lose their lives at the end of the trail, and very sad. Usually the people who are affected are intelligent young people.
How about glue sniffing? Do you ever come into contact with that in your job?
Yes, a little, but not very much, because you see, glue sniffing as such is not an offence.
No, I know, yeah.
And this again, we come into a little bit of contact with it, but not all that much. Again, this is a cult, really, in the little, what we call the teeny boppers, the early teens, because when they go into the late teens, 17, 18, they've usually grown out of it and go either onto alcohol or onto other sort of drugs. Yeah. But it is, in some parts of the county, it is quite a problem.
Is it something that you would, speaking personally, that you would like to see legislation over?
I would, yes. I would certainly like to see some form of legislation. It's going to be difficult to control, but they have started up in Scotland, yes, making it an offence to sell certain products to youngsters.
Yes, I often find that whole thought appalling, that there are shops, some shops, one or two,
yes,
who are willing to make a profit out of it.
Yes, it's very sad.
Let's move away from the depressing side of it, and finally, because time, I always say at this point, because I'm such a gossip, at this point of the day I'm always saying time's against us, let's talk again about you as the family man. You said that you met your wife here in Northampton at the hospital, and that you're married. You've got 2 children, haven't you, I believe?
I've got 5 children, actually.
5 children?
Yes.
Ah.
You might all by the same wife, too.
What happened to family planning?
Well, as I say to my friends, I'm an expert in family planning. I did it very well. My eldest boy's 25, and then I've got a boy of 18. No, I've got a girl of 23 now, and she's out in Las Vegas. She's a Bluebell girl.
Really?
Yes. And so then I've got another boy of 18, a little girl of 12, and my youngest is 3.
Little toddler at 3?
Yes.
I bet he's a handful for you.
That's right.
How about your wife? Because I always imagine a doctor's wife, and talking more about when you were a GP than now, yes, I've always imagined a doctor's wife as being very much like a vicar's wife. That, you know, she's part of the practice, and that's the end of it. I mean, yes,
definitely, and I'm sure that my success as a general practitioner was in fact due to my wife.
Yes. Does that sort of that sort of job put a tremendous strain on a marriage?
Well, it can do. My wife was a nurse before she married me, so she knew what to expect.
Yes.
And she's always been involved with the patients, and she would see the other side of the patients, and the patient who keeps ringing you up and is a pest and a nuisance, my wife would sort of talk to and would say, oh yes, now Hugh, you mustn't do this, you must treat Mrs. So-and-so kindly. So she has been a saving grace to when I was in practice. She certainly looked after me.
Yeah. Do you miss practice? Do you miss meeting the public?
I don't miss it because it's an easier life. I do miss a lot of the families and the friends that I made. Well, fortunately, a lot of them I still keep in touch with. And yeah, that was the nice side of practice. But the nasty side of practice, which was getting up in the middle of the night and being on call.
Yeah.
And in the end, my police work, which really started off as a hobby, and a fascinating hobby, took command. And I just found that I couldn't devote all my time to police work and to general practice.
But you've no regrets?
I've no regrets. No, I really enjoyed my general practice because it gave me a good background to appear as an expert witness. For example, in non-accidental injury cases to children, battered baby cases, I could go in the witness box and speak as a general practitioner who was seeing children every day of my life, and I could talk about bruises in children, say what was normal and what was abnormal. And this, I think, I wouldn't have been able to have done this if I hadn't had all this time in general practice.
I could talk to you about your job all day. It's a fascinating job and a fascinating story. I hope you'll come and join us again fairly soon.
Certainly.
And we'll take it up and have part 2.
Pull it out of the cooker.